Hello there. Thank you for being here. Maybe you've just made it through a long day. Out there, the world is still racing with meetings, deadlines, and headlines that make us forget what truly matters. But let's pause for a moment. What would you do if, one morning, a 7-year-old girl in a red sweater quietly walked into a CEO's office, placed a handwritten resume on the desk, and said, "I need a job because my mom is dying"? That's not a line from a movie. That's where everything began. The story you're about to hear has no miracles, no caped heroes, no perfect villains, just a child who refused to give up, a mother fighting for her life, and a man who once believed he didn't know how to love, until she walked in and changed everything. Do you believe love can start from a piece of paper written in pencil? Have you ever wondered if family could be something we choose, not something written in blood? If so, stay with us until the end of this story, because maybe somewhere in these quiet words, you'll see yourself or someone you once loved, reflected in the smallest, truest details. And if you believe in kindness, in invisible connections, in endings that leave your throat tight with emotion, click subscribe, turn on the bell, and join us again in the stories to come. Because who knows, a small story today might just warm your whole heart tomorrow. And now, let's return to that morning, when a cold CEO was beginning his day, just like any other, until the door to his office opened and a 7-year-old girl stepped in with a sentence that shattered his entire world. Outside, the city was brushed with the soft gold of spring sunlight. Light streamed through the towering glass buildings, staining the skyline in amber. On the 37th floor of Caldwell Innovations, everything moved like clockwork. Precise, polished, impenetrable. Ethan Caldwell had reviewed 3 reports, replied to 9 emails, and declined 2 merger proposals, all before his espresso had a chance to cool. He wasn't a man who left things to chance. His schedule was carved into 10-minute blocks. His suits were tailored 3 months in advance, and his emotions, if he had any, had been buried so deep, even he couldn't recall where they were left. Then came a knock. Software hesitant, followed by the quiet creak of a door opening without waiting for permission. "Mr. Caldwell?" Amelia's voice called out, tinged with something unfamiliar. She was precise, composed, and never flustered. "There's someone here to see you? A little girl? A child?" Ethan looked up, brow faintly furrowed. "A child?" "Yes, sir. She says she has a resume." A heavy silence followed. The city outside kept humming, and then, without another word, the child walked in. She looked no more than 7. Worn red sweater, denim skirt, sneakers dulled from too many miles. Her light brown hair was tousled, her face small, with eyes impossibly large, deep, calm, unnervingly steady. A faded purple backpack hung from her shoulder. In her hands, she held a crumpled piece of paper. She walked straight to the clear glass desk. She didn't glance at Amelia. She didn't hesitate. She laid the paper on the desk, stood on her tiptoes, lifted her chin, and said in a voice so clear, so steady, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, "I need a job." The room fell completely silent. There was nothing cute about her words. They struck somewhere deeper. Ethan looked at her, feeling somehow that something sacred had just entered a space usually reserved for numbers and margins. He slowly picked up the paper. It wasn't typed, of course not. It was written in pencil. The lines were crooked, the handwriting uneven. But the message was unmistakable. Sophie Lane, age 7, skills, I can clean. I'm quiet. I don't make noise. I don't cry in front of people. I can help. I can learn. Please. In each corner of the paper were tiny, hand-drawn stars. Above the word please was a wobbly heart, as if she thought maybe, just maybe, it would help someone pay more attention. Ethan set the paper down and looked at her again. He lowered himself beside the chair, not because she was small, but because something told him this conversation wasn't meant to happen from above. Sophie, sweetheart, you don't need to work, he said gently. You're just a child. She stared at him, unblinking. My mom is dying, she replied. Those words hit the air like thunder on a sunny day. No tears, no trembling. Just the truth, clear and cold like March wind in the mountains. My mom is very weak, Sophie continued. We don't have any money left. She sleeps a lot. I make cereal instead of rice, but there's no more milk. If I get a job, maybe my mom won't have to die. Ethan couldn't move. This wasn't a pitch. This wasn't a plea. It was survival, written in pencil, powered by fragile hope. He glanced toward Amelia, still frozen at the doorway, hand over her mouth. Then back to Sophie. How did you get up here? He asked. I followed the coffee lady. She let me into the elevator. I told her I had an appointment. Amelia spoke up, flustered. I thought she was with someone from the lower floor. I didn't realize. Not until she said your name. Ethan looked again at the handwritten resume then. At the girl who had walked through layers of security, schedules, and silence. Straight into his life. Where's your mom now? At St. Grace Clinic, room 9. It's the little hospital next to the laundromat. My mom doesn't know I came. Why not? She wouldn't let me. But I read your name in the newspaper. People said you fix things really fast. So I thought maybe you could fix this. Ethan said nothing, because he didn't know what to say to a child who wasn't looking at him like a CEO, but like her last hope. He rose to his feet, slowly, steadily. Sophie, he said, can you wait for me a moment? She nodded, both hands clutching the strap of her backpack. Ethan turned to Amelia. Cancel everything today. But sir, everything. Then he looked back at Sophie. Let's go. We're going to see your mom. Her eyes lit up. For the first time in this entire story, a trace of hope flickered in her voice. Really? He nodded. I never promise anything I don't intend to keep. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt this wasn't a promise to someone else. It was a promise to himself. They left the building at 9 a.m., just as Denver was waking up with the honking of cars and the rush of feet. Ethan Caldwell didn't usually step onto the ground floor at that hour. In fact, he hadn't walked out of the building at any unscheduled time in years. But that morning, he carried no briefcase, no phone, only a 7-year-old girl with a faded backpack, and a reason strong enough to shake his entire world. Sophie sat quietly in the back seat of the company's black SUV, legs too short to touch the floor, arms wrapped around her backpack. Her face turned to the window, eyes wide open, watching the city blur past. No one spoke. There was no need. Everything had already been said. In one heartbreaking sentence, my mom is dying. Ethan sat in the front, beside the driver, silent. His hand rested on his knee, gripping the now wrinkled paper, Sophie's resume. In his mind, every crooked letter echoed, every line scraping against the glass walls he'd built around his heart all these years. He'd thought he was used to desperate requests, to face asking him to sign something that might save them. But no one had ever placed a whole tiny heart in his hands, with such plain and powerful words. They arrived at a low building tucked between aging apartment blocks. The sign outside read, Saint. Grace Clinic, in fading paint. The walls were chipped, the windows cloudy with dust. There was no sign of funding, no trace of modern medicine. Ethan stepped out first. The door opened. Sunlight spilled across his tailored suit like a contradiction. Then Sophie jumped down. She didn't speak, didn't ask. She simply walked ahead, as if she knew this alley, this cracked reception desk, this dim hallway smelling of antiseptic all too well. At the front desk, a nurse looked up, pausing at the sight of Ethan, whose presence clearly didn't belong here. But it was the girl who spoke first. Room 9. My mom's name is Grace Lane. The nurse looked at Sophie, then at Ethan, hesitating briefly before pointing down the hall. Sophie walked ahead. Small steps, firm and steady, as if leading a tall, powerful man into a world that was entirely her own. In front of the old blue door, Sophie stopped. My mom sleeps a lot, she said softly. She might not wake up right away. Ethan gave a gentle nod. And then the door opened. The room was small, washed in yellow light, a hospital bed. The monitor's soft beeping measured life in quiet, steady pulses. And on the bed, a woman lay on her side. Frail frame, skin so pale it looked translucent beneath the overhead lamp. 4 lines trailed from her arms. Her chest rose and fell, barely. She was breathing, but each breath looked like a mountain to climb. Sophie stepped to the bedside, set her backpack on a wooden chair, and gently took her mother's icy hand. Mom, she whispered. I brought him. Ethan stood at the foot of the bed, feeling like an intruder. But something inside him cracked. A quiet breaking that had once flickered long ago, buried deep, never given a name. He looked at Grace. He didn't know her, had never heard her name. Yet she felt familiar, not from the street, but from some long-lost part of himself. She didn't wake, didn't stir. But her face was not defeated. Tired, yes, but not broken. And beside her was a child, not afraid, not crying, just calmly doing what adults often avoid, facing it. Ethan stepped forward and knelt beside Sophie. He placed the resume on the bedside table. His voice was low, almost a whisper. I don't know if you can hear me, but today I met your daughter, and I think I will never be the same man again. Sophie sat in the chair, both hands still wrapped around her mother's. Mom used to be a nurse, she said quietly. She helped people. But when she got sick, no one helped her. That's why I came to find him. Her words floated like wind through a window, soft, but enough to echo in the chest of a man who once believed he couldn't feel pain anymore. Ethan said nothing more. He rested a hand on the side of the bed, eyes fixed on Grace's face. No longer a CEO, no longer the decision-maker. In this moment, he was simply a man standing before a woman suspended between life and death, and a child fighting alone with the purest kind of love. A nurse entered quietly to check the monitors. She glanced at Ethan, then Sophie, and seemed to understand this was no ordinary visit. She spoke gently. She's been stable for a few days, but without advanced treatment, we can't continue. There's no more funding. Ethan nodded. When the nurse left, he rose and walked quickly into the hallway. He pulled out his phone and made 2 calls. One to his private physician. I need the full medical file on Grace Lane. Immediately. Prepare for a transfer. One to his lawyer. I want a private relief fund created under my name. Discreet. No press. For one person only. All expenses. I'll cover everything. When he returned, Sophie was still there. her head resting against her mother's arm, eyes heavy with exhaustion. Ethan sat beside her. She opened her eyes and looked up at him. "Will you really help?" she asked. He gently squeezed her tiny hand. "I promise," he said. "I won't leave you and your mom alone." And in that moment, he didn't feel like a man offering mercy. He felt like a man being awakened by a child, a piece of paper, and a love that had never been named. The ride from St. Grace Clinic to the private hospital took only 18 minutes. But for Ethan Caldwell, it was the longest journey of his life. Not because of traffic, not because of distance, but because, for once, he couldn't control the speed of his own heart. Inside the car, Sophie sat between two adults, her small hand gripping her mother's. Grace remained unconscious, her breathing so faint that, without the soft beeping of the monitor, someone might think she was already gone. Ethan sat across from them, eyes locked on that image, a child who refused to let go, a mother clinging to life with whatever warmth remained in her fading skin. Throughout the ride, Sophie said little. She only looked out the window at each red light, her eyes searching, as if looking for proof that the world still had room for kindness. Her backpack stayed on her lap, and inside it, the resume, scribbled in pencil, still remained. A testament to everything she'd done to hold on to something adults often forget how to fight for: hope. When they arrived, Ethan stepped out first. He opened the door for Sophie, but she didn't move just yet. Instead, she gently shook her mother's hand. "Mom, we're here," she whispered. "We're going to the new place now, with clean beds, bright lights, and people who will help you." Grace didn't open her eyes, but her fingers moved, just slightly. And to Sophie, that was enough. That was hope. A full medical team waited at the hospital entrance. They didn't know much, only that this woman was being transferred on direct orders from Ethan Caldwell. They didn't need more. Their movements were calm, precise, without question. As the gurney rolled inside, Sophie followed closely, never more than a step behind. Ethan walked beside her, not like a CEO, but like someone who finally belonged. The new hospital room was bright, with a large window that opened out to a garden. Sunlight poured in, like a quiet signal that the darkest days might finally be retreating. Grace was settled onto the bed. The machines were connected. The doctors began monitoring her vitals. Sophie stood in the corner of the room, silently watching it all unfold. Once everything had stabilized, she walked over to the bed and pulled a piece of paper from her backpack. It was a drawing, a small house. In front of it stood 3 people: a woman with long hair, a child with a radiant smile, and a man in a blue suit, also smiling. At the bottom, in large block letters, Sophie had written, "My family." Ethan looked at the drawing and didn't know what to say. No one had ever drawn him into a home before, much less one where he was smiling. That afternoon, after the nurses had finished their rounds and the room had gone quiet again, Ethan sat beside Sophie on the bench by the window. She leaned her head against his shoulder, hands wrapped around a cup of hot cocoa the nurse had brought in. "Uncle Ethan," she said softly, "do you think my mom will wake up?" Ethan looked at her, then at the woman lying still between the wires and machines, and he couldn't offer an empty promise. "I don't know," he said gently, "but she has a better chance now, and no matter what happens, I'm staying." Sophie nodded. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for more. She just held onto the cup, like its warmth was the only thing between her and the world falling apart. That evening, once the ward had settled, Sophie was taken to a temporary room near the pediatric unit. Ethan arranged everything, from the pillows and blankets to the soft lighting, to make sure she wouldn't feel like she was in a hospital. On the table, he left a new box of crayons, a small gift. "You can draw more, if you want," he said. Sophie smiled, nodded, and began to draw as Ethan quietly returned to Grace's room. She still hadn't woken, but her skin looked a little warmer. Her heartbeat is steady. The readings, more hopeful. Ethan stood for a long time, watching her. No one else was there. No one to witness it. But inside, he knew. He was beginning to feel something he hadn't dared name in years. Connection. He pulled up a chair and sat beside her, his hand resting gently on the side of the bed. No emails, no meetings, no spreadsheets to compare. Just a man, waiting for a woman to open her eyes. Not because he knew her, but because he owed her something. Something even he couldn't fully understand. That night, Ethan didn't go home. He stayed, watching over a silent room where a mother was fighting death, and a father, though never called that, was learning how to love again through simply being there. The next morning, Ethan Caldwell woke up in the family waiting room. No alarm clock, no calendar updates, just a soft, pale light filtering through a white curtain, and the distant beep of a heart monitor from the room next door. His body ached, but his mind was clearer than it had been in years. There was no coffee, no conference table, but there were no walls left either. Nothing between him and the real world anymore. When he walked back into Grace's room, she was still asleep. But Sophie was already there, sitting cross-legged in the leather chair by the bed, knees tucked to her chest, hair tied neatly with a rubber band. In her hands was a new drawing. It showed her mother sleeping, with Sophie beside her, and a man in a suit watching over them. Beneath it, in bold pencil strokes, she had written, "Uncle Ethan, the one who stayed." Ethan stood still for a long while, afraid to disturb the fragile peace of that moment. Then, slowly, he stepped closer. "How long have you been drawing?" he asked gently. Since the sky was still gray, Sophie replied, eyes never leaving the page. "Mom's still asleep, but she looks different today. Lighter." Ethan nodded, then leaned in to look at Grace again. Her face had more color. Her lips weren't as pale and blue as the night before. And in that moment, he realized this wasn't charity anymore. This was a part of his life now. Around 9 a.m., his phone started to vibrate again. One message after another. His assistant reported unread emails. The board of directors was requesting to reschedule the shareholder meeting. A major investor demanded updates. All of it made sense. All of it was important. But Ethan replied with a single message. "Push everything. I'm where I need to be." And for the first time in his life, Ethan Caldwell wrote something that wasn't part of a strategy, wasn't profit-driven, but carried more weight than any plan he had ever made. He stepped outside to make a few more calls. One to order breakfast for Sophie from the little bakery near the hospital, the blueberry pastry she'd once mentioned. Another way to instruct the company's HR department to pull from the welfare fund and create a special medical profile under Grace's name. He didn't want her to become a charity case. He wanted her to be treated with dignity, not pity. When he returned to the hospital room, Sophie had changed out of her red sweater into a white hoodie with a little bear face on the front. A nurse smiled at him. "She looked cold, so I picked this from the spare clothes closet. Fits perfectly." Ethan nodded his thanks, then sat down next to Sophie. "I brought you pastries," he said, "and cocoa." She took them, didn't squeal, just smiled. The kind of smile that didn't need to be big to warm you up, like April sunlight slipping into a cold city street. That entire morning, Ethan didn't check a single email. He read with Sophie, a children's book borrowed by the nurse from the hospital library. He couldn't remember the last time he'd read aloud to anyone. But as Sophie leaned against him, softly echoing the lines, Ethan realized the smallest things, when given at the right time, could become the greatest miracles. By afternoon, the head physician came in to check on Grace. Ethan asked to hear everything. No shortcuts, no softened truths. The diagnosis hadn't changed. Grace would need long-term treatment, possibly surgery. But there was hope. Her heartbeat was steady. Her vitals were responding to medication. Her body was fighting. And according to the doctor, much of it came from an emotional factor. She wasn't alone anymore. After the doctor left, Sophie continued drawing. This time, it was a garden. 3 people, a woman sitting on a stone bench, a child riding a bike, and a man pushing a wheelchair with flower-shaped wheels. Ethan stood watching for a while, then asked, "Is that us?" Sophie nodded. "Mom might not be able to walk soon. But if there's a garden and someone to push her, she can still see the sky." Ethan couldn't reply. His throat tightened. He had never imagined himself drawn into anyone's family picture. But now, a little girl had taught him this. You don't need to share blood to be called family. You just need to show up at the right moment. As evening approached, golden light poured through the windows like honey. Sophie had fallen asleep beside her mother's bed, still holding her pencil. Ethan gently placed a blanket over her small shoulders. He sat down again, resting one hand over Grace's. No words, no promises, just presence. And that was what Grace had needed most, what Sophie had needed most for so many years. Not salvation, not miracles, just someone willing to stop, to listen, to feel. Amelia never thought a child could do what an entire industry of executive coaches couldn't. Change Ethan Caldwell. She had worked as his personal assistant for 4 years, watched hundreds of meetings, thousands of decisions are made in under 30 seconds. Ethan didn't small talk, never repeated himself, and he never said the words, "Let's pause." He was a river with no bends, a system calibrated down to every breath. Until that morning. Amelia remembered exactly the moment the office door opened and a girl in a red sweater walked in, as if she belonged on his schedule. She didn't say much. She simply placed a piece of paper on the desk, looked up, and said she needed a job. Because her mom was dying. In all her years working for Ethan, Amelia had never seen him freeze for so long over a single sentence. Not for a misplaced digit, not for a market crash, but for the calm, terrifying stillness in the eyes of a 7-year-old. She had assumed it would pass, a moment of emotion. But when Ethan stepped out of the office, silent, walking beside the girl and ordering the entire day cleared, Amelia knew. Something inside him had cracked. Days later, no one at the company had seen Ethan. Rumors buzzed through the hallways. He was working remotely, negotiating a merger, or scouting new investments overseas. But only Amelia knew. Ethan was at a small hospital on the edge of Denver, sitting beside a woman he'd never met, reading fairy tales to a little girl who, just days ago, had been a stranger. The first time she visited, at Ethan's request to bring some documents, Amelia stood quietly at the doorway. Inside, Sophie was asleep, her head resting on Ethan's lap. He didn't move. His hand lay gently on her shoulder, eyes gazing out the window, where evening light cast its glow on a pencil drawing taped to the wall. It was a house. No address, no number, just 3 people. A woman reading a book, a little girl on a swing, and a man, holding both their hands. At the bottom, in Sophie's tilted handwriting, a temporary family, but the one I believe in most. Amelia didn't call out. She didn't enter. She just stood there, heart trembling like she was the one stepping across the line between the world she knew and the world she had forgotten still existed. A world where things weren't measured in minutes, but in the presence. That evening, when she returned again, Ethan was tying Sophie's hair back, a small gesture, meaningless to others. But to Amelia, it was like watching someone learning to be human all over again. That girl, Ethan said, didn't ask me for money, didn't ask for pity. She only asked for a chance. And then he smiled. For the first time in months, a real smile. And I think what she doesn't know is she just gave me a chance to fix myself. In the days that followed, Amelia became the quiet bridge. She arranged paperwork remotely, shielded his calendar, turned down meetings that didn't matter. But more than that, she was the first to see. Ethan's change wasn't just emotional, it was behavioral. He remembered Sophie's favorite pastry. He learned how to choose the right scarf for Grace. He knew how to sit in silence just long enough for Sophie to feel safe. He was no longer the man who made decisions. He had become the man who stayed. One afternoon, as Amelia brought in a file folder, she found Sophie sitting on the hospital floor, folding paper. She was making tiny boats out of old prescription slips, placing them one by one on the bedside table, as if preparing for a journey. "If Mom wakes up," she said, "I'll take her traveling on paper boats first, so she can remember all the beautiful places." Amelia crouched down, picked up one of the boats, and asked, "What about Uncle Ethan?" Sophie tilted her head in thought, then answered, "He doesn't need to travel, because he just found his home." Amelia had no reply. She turned to look at Ethan, standing in the corner of the room, postponing a major meeting for the 3rd time that week. And in that moment, she knew. If anyone ever believed a CEO couldn't change, they had never met a child whose heart was bigger than her age. The day Grace opened her eyes, there was no sunlight. Just an ordinary morning, gray sky draped over the hospital window like a sheer curtain. But for Sophie, it was the first morning in many that light had returned. Not from the sky, but from the woman lying beside her. Grace opened her eyes slowly, blinking as if pulling herself back from the fog. She didn't speak, not yet, but that blink held Sophie's breath still. She whispered, "Mom." And then it happened. A miracle smaller than breath, a word spoken from lips barely strong enough to move. "Sophie." Ethan stood at the foot of the bed. He didn't move. He didn't dare. He feared even the smallest motion might shatter that fragile moment. When Grace's gaze shifted and found his, something passed between them. Not memory, recognition, as if, even without ever meeting him, she somehow knew. This is the man who stayed. That afternoon, the hospital room felt inexplicably warmer. Not because of temperature, but because, for the first time in days, there were voices, laughter, soft conversation woven between the hums of the monitors. Grace didn't speak much. She was tired. But she spoke. Sophie told her everything, about the resume, the backpack, how she'd applied for a job instead of asking for money. She told it like a child would, piece by piece. with a kind of logic only children who've lived close to the edge understand. Ethan didn't interrupt. He simply listened. And sometimes, when Grace closed her eyes and tried to smile, his throat tightened. Not from pity, but from a feeling he had never known until now. What it means to belong to a family not made of blood, but of choice. The next morning, Grace was allowed to sit up for the first time. A nurse supported her. Sophie stood beside her. Ethan sat across. As she pushed herself upright, grimacing from the pain, Sophie whispered, "Mom, you can be in pain, but you've never been weak." Grace turned to her daughter, eyes glistening, then looked at Ethan. "Thank you for being here." He shook his head. "It's not kindness," he said quietly. "It's because I need to be." No one said anything more, but something had shifted, an invisible thread pulling tighter, unspoken but undeniable. That evening, they had dinner together for the first time. Just hospital food, some reheated soup, a small muffin Amelia had brought in. But for Sophie, it was a celebration. She sat in the middle, talking about school, adding details to the picture she'd been drawing. This time a table, 3 chairs, a window with light pouring in. Ethan was drawn more clearly now, still in his suit, but this time with a cup of cocoa in front of him. "You drink like me," Sophie said, "because you sit at the same table." Ethan looked at the drawing, then at her, and nodded. Not because the words were beautiful, but because the same table was something he hadn't known he'd missed. That night, when Sophie drifted to sleep beside her mother, Ethan pulled a chair by the window and sat in silence. There was nothing special outside. Just patches of daisies and low lavender bushes. But he stayed there for a long time, because for the first time in years, he didn't need to be anywhere else. Quietly, he pulled out his phone and played a wordless song, soft like wind, drifting gently through the room. Grace was still awake. She didn't speak, but her eyes never left him. When the music stopped, her voice came, faint but clear. "I don't know where this is going, but I know we're not alone anymore." Ethan nodded. He didn't answer. He didn't have to, because she was right. They were no longer 3 strangers, no longer a benefactor, recipient, or the child caught between. They were touching something none of them had dared to name: a family. 3 days after Grace was able to stand with assistance, a woman appeared in the hospital room. She wore a light blue blouse, a plastic name tag, and carried a thick folder. Not a doctor, not a nurse, but her face was kind, her eyes understanding. She introduced herself as Mara, a hospital social worker. Her job, to assess recovery, connect legal support, and follow up on special cases that may need protection. Ethan was present. He was peeling an apple by the window while Sophie played checkers with her mother. When Mara saw him, her expression changed. Not from fear, but from surprise. She hadn't expected the billionaire to still be here. Still cutting fruit for a child with a disposable plastic knife. The conversation took place in the family support room. Mara carefully opened the file, asking Ethan about the hospital transfer, his reasons for intervention, and everything he had done over the past week. She couldn't hide her astonishment when she saw that all documents were in order. Additional health insurance, legal aid applications, even a signed form requesting temporary custodial rights for Sophie, in case Grace remained unconscious longer than expected. Every form bore the same signature: Ethan Caldwell. But what made her pause, there was a handwritten note in the corner: This is not charity. This is family, if she'll have me. Mr. Caldwell, Mara said, her voice gentle but direct. I have one question, not legal. Personal? Ethan nodded. She looked up at him, without hesitation. If Grace's condition worsens, or if she needs extended recovery, have you considered becoming Sophie's legal guardian? The question wasn't surprising, but hearing it from someone outside himself, Ethan felt time slow down. 1 second, 2, 3 seconds of silence. He had never considered the title formally. He had never called himself Dad. Never imagined a life with a child in the house. A small voice waking him at dawn, a hand reaching out when no one else dared come close. We're not pressuring you, Mara said. And this isn't a binding decision. But Sophie, she clearly trusts you. The kind of trust that only comes from a child who's been let down many times and has finally chosen someone who didn't walk away. Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked out the window of the consultation room, where Sophie was running across the rehab lawn. The sunlight crowned her messy brown hair like a soft halo. She raised her arm, holding a paper airplane, shouting, "Take off! Let's go find a new home." He watched her, and in that moment, all the meetings, all the numbers, all the so-called reasons that had once driven him fell silent. He turned back to Mara, eyes steady. I didn't plan for any of this, he said. But since the day she walked into my office, I also haven't once planned to leave. A few hours later, after Grace had rested and Sophie was sketching quietly in her own room, Ethan walked in. She looked up, put her pencil down, and asked, Did you talk to the lady in the blue shirt? He was surprised. You knew? Sophie nodded. They come to ask about the future. Kids get asked those things a lot. Ethan sat beside her. And what do you think about your future? Sophie tilted her head, thoughtful. If Mom gets better, I want to go home. But if she's not ready yet, I just want a place with a window seat, someone to tell stories, and someone who says they'll come back tomorrow. Ethan smiled faintly. He didn't promise anything. But he rested his hand lightly over hers, and she let it stay. No questions, no fear. In the hallway, Mara saw it all. She didn't write anything else in her report. She didn't need to, because some things can't be measured by forms or assessments. Some bonds don't come from legal documents, but from hands held and never pulled away. That afternoon, rain began to fall. The droplets settled on the hospital window like breath, forming faint, blurred streaks like fading memories. Sophie sat at the small table near the glass, a brand new box of colored pencils open in front of her. She was focused, not like a child playing, but like someone preserving something sacred. In the corner of the room, Grace was asleep, recovering from her first physical therapy session. Ethan sat across from Sophie, not reading, not on his phone, just watching, as if every pencil stroke could teach him something he'd never learned before. When Sophie finally set her pencil down, she didn't hand over the drawing immediately. She looked at it for a long time, tilted the page, and then slowly walked it over to Ethan, offering it with both hands. I started this yesterday, she said, but I only felt ready to give it to you today. Ethan took it. It showed a small house with a red roof, a row of blooming lavender in front. 3 figures stood at the door, a woman in a long dress, clearly Grace, a little girl with a ponytail, Sophie, and a man in a deep blue suit. He wasn't holding a briefcase, he wasn't wearing a watch. His hand was holding the girl's, and beneath them, in slightly wobbly handwriting, Our home, if everyone chooses to stay. Ethan looked at the drawing for a long time. His eyes stayed fixed on that sentence. And something inside his heart stirred, not loud, but strong enough to quiet everything else. A simple line, but it made all the questions he'd been avoiding impossible to ignore. Sophie didn't ask what he thought. She just sat down beside him, didn't touch his hand, didn't look at his face. She just waited. Ethan set the page on his knee, hands still holding the edges. "You know," he said, his voice lower than usual, "I've lived in a very big house for a very long time, but no one's ever drawn it before." Sophie looked up. "Was it missing the person who holds your hand?" He didn't answer, because sometimes a question from a child is already the answer. That night, the rain continued to fall. Sophie was moved to a private room near the rehab wing. Ethan stayed behind with Grace. She was more awake now, but her body was still frail. He sat beside her, telling her what Sophie had said. The little girl wanted to know who would be holding her hand in the future. Grace gave a breath of a laugh. "That means she's already chosen." Ethan looked at her. For the first time, he didn't feel like the main character in the story. For the first time, he understood it was Sophie who had led them all. The next morning, he drove to an office building near the city park. No one knew why he was there. No press, no assistant, just him, carrying the drawing Sophie had given him, now laminated, tucked carefully into a folder like it was a vital document. He laid it gently on a real estate agent's desk. "I want to find a house like this," he said. The house was found 3 days later. Not large, not luxurious, but it had a garden, a row of lavender, and a porch just big enough for 3 chairs. Ethan didn't sign to buy it. He signed a 1-year lease. When the agent asked why, he replied, "Because I don't want to make decisions alone anymore." Back at the hospital, he handed Sophie the key. She held it like a strange piece of candy, inspecting it for a moment, then asked, "What are you going to do with the house?" Ethan knelt down, met her eyes. "I'm not going to do anything with it. I just wanted to make sure that when your mom is better, you'll have a place to come home to. And if she still needs time, you won't have to leave either." Sophie looked at him, said nothing, then threw her arms around him in a quick hug and ran off to tell the nurse that she got a moving letter from someone not related by blood. That evening, Grace sat quietly after story time. Once the nurse had left, once Sophie had drifted to sleep, she turned to Ethan, her voice hoarse but certain. "You don't owe me this," she said. "I never asked for any of it." Ethan nodded. "I know." She continued. "Then why are you still doing it?" He looked at her for a long time, then answered, no drama, no emotion, just truth. Because there were small hands that drew me into their picture. And for the first time in my life, I didn't want to step out. The day Grace stepped into the hospital garden for the first time after 2 weeks of being bedridden, no one called it a miracle. There was no background music, no cameras. Just a wheelchair gently rolled over the threshold, a thin blanket draped across her legs, and a man walking silently beside her, quiet as the breeze weaving through the lavender bushes in the courtyard. Sophie led the way. She ran ahead on her little legs, tireless, as if her mother's presence under the sun was the reward for every night she'd spent counting heartbeats on the monitor screen. Grace didn't say much. She just inhaled deeply, like each molecule of air was a lullaby from some forgotten fairy tale. Ethan stopped the wheelchair in a corner of the garden, where morning light slanted softly through thin tree branches, casting gentle stripes across the earth. "Is this enough?" he asked. Grace shook her head. "Nothing's ever enough," she replied. "But this is the first time I'm not afraid to breathe." Sophie spread a checkered cloth across a stone bench. In her hands were a sandwich box, a peeled apple, and a bottle of juice Ethan had packed that morning. She placed them all carefully, then clapped her hands. "We're having a picnic." The sentence sounded innocent, almost silly. But in Grace's eyes, it was a declaration. We are alive, not just existing, living together. They stayed outside for nearly an hour. Ethan told a few stories from his childhood, rare and scattered, but just enough to make Sophie laugh uncontrollably. Grace listened silently, eyes never leaving him. Not because the stories were funny, but because she was watching a man learn to share, piece by piece. A man who had spent his life in cold boardrooms, now trying to remember what his mother's favorite meal had been. And even if he wasn't sure, he still told it. Because in this space, imperfection was the most beautiful thing. By late afternoon, a nurse wheeled Grace back inside. Sophie followed close behind. Ethan lingered by the door, eyes resting on Sophie's latest drawing taped beside the window. This time, 3 figures sat on the grass, with a caption beside them. "We don't need miracles. We just need each other." That night, Ethan didn't go back to his apartment. He stayed, read to Sophie, told stories to Grace, quietly cleared the table, adjusted the chairs. No one asked him to. No one assigned it. He just did it, as if it was the only thing that had ever made sense in a life once filled with more important things. The next morning, the head physician stopped by with good news. If Grace continued progressing, she could be discharged within 10 days. But she would need somewhere calm, pressure-free, with clean air, and, ideally, a place where she wouldn't feel like a burden. Sophie turned to Ethan. She didn't wait for him to speak. "We already have a house," she said. "One with windows and purple flowers. She's not a burden. She's the reason we have a home." Her words made both the doctor and nurse fall silent, and Ethan just smiled and nodded. Because she was right. Grace was the reason. The reason Sophie had knocked on a door she didn't fully understand. The reason a man who never believed in family had stayed. 3 days later, they arrived at the new house. Ethan opened the front door, but it was Sophie who walked in first. She ran through the living room, opened cabinets, flipped light switches, and squealed when she discovered the window really did look out to the garden. Grace entered slowly, still steadying herself with the wheelchair. But her eyes no longer looked tired. They looked moved. In the kitchen, a kettle was already waiting. On the table, a small basket held drawing paper, crayons, and 2 new ceramic mugs. Ethan placed a hand gently on her shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. She could feel it. This was real. That first night, Sophie slept in her own room, for the first time in weeks, not in a hospital bed. Ethan stayed on the sofa by the living room window, and Grace, in a white bed tucked against the wall, slept without breathing support for the first time. Everything was still. But it wasn't empty. It was peace. The kind of peace that only comes when you finally know you're not alone. Spring in Denver doesn't always arrive, clearly. Some days, sunshine will spill gold across the porch, only to be swept away moments later by a cold mountain wind. But in a small house at the end of a street lined with lavender, spring didn't announce itself. It came through a warm mug of cocoa, through the scratch of a pencil on the paper, through the gaze of a man who no longer wore a watch, because here, time wasn't measured in minutes, but in the presence. Grace could now take a few steps around the house on her own. She still needed rest, still had to follow her treatment plan closely. But now, when she wiped the kitchen counter with a steady hand, when she rested her palm on Sophie's shoulder as the little girl told stories about school, when she quietly smiled at the sight of Ethan starting the fire, she knew she didn't have to fight alone anymore. Sophie had started school again. She was driven there each morning in the very same car that once carried Ethan to million-dollar meetings. Now, the back seat bore a small name tag that read, Sophie Lane, Grade 2B. Each afternoon, she would run into the kitchen, tell her mom about her friends, then sit down to draw while Ethan worked on redesigning the mini greenhouse in the backyard. She no longer drew with loneliness. She drew with imagination, with color. And every drawing had 3 people, not 2. One afternoon, while Grace was resting, Ethan sat on the porch holding a letter, a handwritten note from Sophie, her first letter to him, not to ask for a job, but to say thank you. Dear Uncle Ethan, thank you for giving me more than a job. You gave me someone to believe in, and you gave my mom a place to live, not just to heal. If someone asks me someday, who's your dad? I'll say, he's the first one who didn't leave when I said I needed help. Ethan didn't fold the letter. He left it open on his knee, staring out at the gently swaying trees. He'd once had everything: reputation, power, a schedule that ran to the minute. But none of it had ever made him feel like he was in the right place. Until now. That evening, they had dinner under the soft glow of the kitchen lights. Just vegetable soup, fresh-baked bread, and water. But for Sophie, it was a feast. She sat in the middle, occasionally sneaking an extra slice of bread onto her mother's plate, then whispering, Uncle Ethan always cuts the bread a little crooked, but I think that makes it real. Grace laughed. Ethan pretended to be offended. That's because I'm not a chef. But in his eyes, something glowed brighter than his smile. Gratitude for being here, in this place, with these people. At this exact moment. Later that night, Sophie came into the living room, holding the final drawing from her school project. It wasn't a house, not a garden, not a man in a suit. Just a dinner table. 3 chairs. On the table, 3 plates, 3 cups, and a small note that read, Just a regular dinner, but it's what I used to wish for. Ethan hung that drawing in the living room. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was true. Because it was proof that sometimes what saves a life isn't something grand, but a simple meal, a hand that doesn't let go, and a promise, kept not in words, but in action. Not everyone is born into a family, but everyone deserves to live in a place they can call home. Not because of paperwork or bloodlines or titles, but because in that place you have someone to wait for, someone to come back to, someone who will answer. When you walk in, lay down a trembling piece of paper and say, I need a job. Because sometimes love begins with an ask, but survives on a promise never withdrawn. This story didn't begin with a miracle. It began with a handwritten resume and a little girl who walked quietly into the life of a man who had forgotten how to love. But sometimes, all it takes is one person who doesn't leave to help you start again. If you've ever believed that family is where we choose to stay, not just where we were born, then you're in the right place. Leave us a comment below. Has someone ever shown up at the right time in your life? And if they did, were you brave enough to stay for them? If quiet acts of kindness, unspoken connections, and slow journeys of healing resonate with you, subscribe and turn on notifications to stay with us here at Hear&Wonder. Here, every story is a doorway. And maybe, just maybe, if you pause for one more second, you'll see yourself in one of them.